Hello, this is Robert Ellis from DSP Plug. How are you doing? People are pretty headstrong. They're headstrong about the fact that operating systems and software are not a controlled thing. So, how is it that we're going to create an operating system both for ourselves and for our governments to protect us and protect our data? Data and facts, database entries are all things that have been theorized upon by religion long ago. And I'm sure we all dreamed of such a concept where um, priests or popes of a sort, you know, of any religion, religious leaders of a sort, they would look at the data, monks and viziers and imams and what have you, all of the different names for people who accumulate data, they would be leaders at one point in time. And that would be a strange thing for us in this modern age to understand. But nonetheless, religious leaders had been leaders or governments in the past. And when we look at that process, we also realize that many of the monks, of course, many of the imams or many of the sheikhs or priests or nuns, Maida people, they realized that sometimes you had to keep a leader honest, right? There was always there was always safety checks, weren't there? There were always means by which society in general would keep itself honest, and and it's hard. It's hard not to be paranoid. And their paranoia of ages past was not without merit. And it's funny to see that even the computer itself is designed with all of those things in mind. And what I'm referring to is the force latency of ASM, ASM in a computer, and various other components of the computer. We think about data and we think about how data is distributed. Could it be distributed in a different way? Yes, absolutely. We could make a computer that had nothing, just processing data. And yet, new operating systems like Windows and Linux and Apple, all of these things, they've started to rely upon these inconsistencies so as to make it possible to enable advertising and heuristics and biorhythmics and all of these things, but ultimately the end user or even the government who employs those operating systems has less or no control of their data and how it is utilized, especially in the way of ports. And there's usually always a back door. I had made some very interesting comments, posts, videos about digital signal processing and really how genius it is. And the thing that makes it so genius is merely that it is just a chip. It's a very simple chip and it allows math to be construed and to do something. And that's great. things like flying cars and cheaper, more environmentally friendly means to provide our telecommunications services, sensors to allow law enforcement to do all of these amazing things to stop crime and to stop abuse and to stop terrible things from happening. The army, all the same, to stop people from attacking people when they're angry. It's very common. But ultimately, it comes down to associative arrays. And what that means is that timing has always been something that isn't perfect, right? We have considered timing in computers. Ultimately, it cannot be perfect. And for that, we have safeguards to prevent that causing an error within a computer. And that has always been the challenge, whether it is the most basic, whether it is the most advanced, timing has been the issue. There are types of matrix types of mathematics. And what they do is they force an array in multiple signals to come together. And you can use a certain type of a matrices, which does allow timing. It does allow timing. The only problem with it is that decimals. That was a challenge for programmers. I'm sure that they had considered matrices, but decimals was always in the way. How do you make an imperfect signal perfect? Because the timing might screw something up. There's of course two physical components, isn't there? There's a transistor in a way, in a sense, theoretical transistor that does that function. And then there's an exotic transistor. And when we look back, we realize that both the people who were considered Aryan, and even African too, true. There were many people who had alliances and beliefs, and they thought about that. They had thought about that, and they realized potentially there was some really interesting things, and they wanted to be really impressive people, and they said, "Here is the transistor." Everyone was impressed by the transistor. They said, "Wow, what an interesting mathematical concept." And yet, the transistor, it was a scientific idea. Asia thought about it too. They thought about it long and hard, and they realized that timing of the transistor was the problem. Because technically, you can have many transistors that do something like a computer. It could be that at one time there was something like a computer, way back when. But the issue would have been timing. You'd have all these functions that go through a transistor, and then they kind of work. But if you have multiple transistors, things would be done at a different time. Like, it would go from one to the next transistor. But by the time it was done, there would be a little bit of latency from the one to the next. So while the function would work, maybe the timing of it might be off. So how do you correct for that problems with timing? Asia had thought about that too. They'd made resistors, they made capacitors, they made so many things which are amazing. They are not obsolete. It seemed to me like Asia was really trying hard to make a physical component that could be utilized that had the perfect latency, and they were also very old, you know, thousands of years ago. But in practical application, it wasn't necessarily something that was employed until later, until, you know, at least not on paper. Perhaps governments, perhaps scientists long ago made these things and said, wow, what can it do? And that would have been really cool. Imagine being someone way back when who thought, wow, what does it do? I don't know. But to make a long story short, the Asians realized that it was impedance that could allow timing. You could force something through a physical component and or many connections through a physical component, depending. And that meant the transistors allowed that. So you could have many transistors doing many functions, sending their signals to one of these Asiatic transistors, which relied on impedance, and it would all kind of come together at the same speed, kind of like a buffer. But the timing would still not be perfect. Now our new computers are kind of based on those ideas. But the thing that detects and makes sure that there's timings is all over the computer. There's tons of them. But could it be done in a simpler way? Absolutely. And that is with this matrices. But the problem has always been the timing, of course. We rely on the physical, and anything physical does degrade over time. It's not something that we can just rely upon all the time. And technically, a much simpler computer could be made utilizing a matrices. And boy, would that ever be great for government and military because they would be much less worried about hackers. What that means is that various data sources, arrays, you've heard of an array. Array is many different pieces that might be data that is combined to make one data, or it is data that is separate. So maybe it's different things, like sort of like a database, different lists of things. And yet in a computer, they chose to make that an associative array. An associative array means that there's two arrays that are combined. And what that means is that one, like an associative array, for instance, would be the first array would be a list of things with commas. It would say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that is an associative array, but of course it goes from 0 to 9 to do the same thing, right? And that is cool. But then I think during the uh, making of the computer, they wanted more. They wanted to combine arrays, they wanted to combine all kinds of features. But that belied a stepwise function. People thought to themselves, which is better, to have an associative array or an array? A plain array allows you to just have these chunks of data without specifying some other table of contents. And then it just kind of throws it together, and it's a lot faster. Without that associative array, it is much faster. Does it have less security? Sort of, sort of. But it actually would function in just about real time. So what that means is that if you were to build a computer in this light, you could technically take chips that are already used for computers and make a computer that was 75 times as fast. And that's always been a caveat. And the problem is that it's timing. All of these things, of course, were designed to allow timing. I think people can remember back to the 70s if you're older, or 80s, if you can see those old computers. They couldn't necessarily keep up with video. The video would be slow, and sometimes we see indication of that in our phones, don't we? When we speak or when we're looking at a selfie camera, we remind ourselves that the timing isn't perfect. For instance, I have a Motorola Hyper, one Hyper phone, and it has a faster selfie camera, so I do rely upon it. I also have a Google Pixel 9, but I find the amount of latency when I look at myself in the screen throws me off a little. The latency is a little bit higher, and the difference is that the Hyper has a completely analog selfie camera, and that is pretty cool. Faster is cool. And in the way of computers, I'm sure that Army, if they were trying to make something that allows them to defend the world and the universe, what have you, is great too. And all of these civilians are in the way, keeping them honest, spreading all of these back doors. But one day we're going to have to make an honest computer, aren't we? An honest computer. It's not ridiculous. People aren't ridiculous, and yet the amount of latency added to computers is not necessary. It's not. There is no reason why a computer needs that extra time to function. It's actually mundane to build something that does that. But that means like all of these features like virtual disks, virtual drives, ASM. It means that all of these things like RAM, not necessary. You wouldn't need them if you just used a plain array. But a plain array cannot be controlled by timing, can it? Like the Asians realized, you could make a nearly perfect transistor by hiring the best hammerers and smiths, so as to take a tiny little hammer and pound a tiny little bit of steel. And they would keep testing that steel for the impedance. And then they would put it inside of a glass shell, wearing gloves, inside of kind of like a room that is very clean without dust. And then they would make a lot of money. Those people used to call themselves sorcerers. And that is why I lovingly use this term, sorcerers. Sorcerers were kind of like people who had a skill here and a skill there, but were very good. But they were not considered experts. They were just an expert at one or two or three or four things, and they did them very well. So a sorcerer might be somebody who people consider stupid or, not all that smart, but they could do something very well. One thing or two things or three things. And that is what sorcerer had meant. And that's why I lovingly used it. I call myself a DSP sorcerer because I don't think I'm the biggest genius. And a lot of people can see these similar concepts, and they also realize that they're not geniuses. But yes, an array can smooth things out with the matrices because the matrices would allow timing, but the problem is the amount of decimals. Making an honest computer requires more decimals. A matrices can allow the timing to be perfect with some kind of clock thing, but that would require that when the array was added together, that it came at unity. And this is like electricity, you see. so that the data that came out was perfect and it didn't have any error or loss. And that does require decimals because it's mathematics. And while it is possible, it's expensive, and it's been expensive for quite a long time. Now that we're more modern, suddenly computers like that are more possible. When back in the day, there would have been probably some theoretical computer that people made, and then there would be like these knights, and they would all protect it and say, one day we're going to use this amazing computer towards something great. And everyone said, oh yes, our people are the best. You know, it's kind of silly to think of that. It's kind of like Monty Python, but it's meaningful. It's very meaningful, and it is not funny because these people were the geniuses who did this, who actually figured out, like, let's say, for instance, how to make a word processor or a calculator. They must have thought, oh, this is so much better than an abacus. This can do anything. And they were right. And they were geniuses. And we kind of worship them, don't we? We look back and we say, well, I didn't believe you before, but you showed me a calculator and damn, you sold. Right? But yeah, in the long run, with an array and a matrices, it's possible, but all the data has to add up to the same at the beginning to end. And that would be the only caveat that would slow down the timing, is that there needs to be a device that makes sure that the decimals are the same from the beginning to the end. And if that's the case, perfect math, perfect computer, and you could use existing chips and all of that, and it would probably be like 100 or 400 or 75 or 20% faster. And that's nuts. We purposefully slow ourselves down so as to make a computer that we can rely upon in many ways. But why? Why? Oh, I know why. It's so that buffers, buffers can exist. Error correction. And that's kind of what ASM is. ASM is an assembly model thing that kind of speeds up math and it allows uh, the unit to continue to function even if there is an error, even if there is this or that, like video, for instance. Video would say, okay, I'm providing all of the frames per second, but I'm missing these frames. Well, in a computer like I'm talking about, it would say, doesn't work. 0 and 1 are not equaling 1, or 2 and 2 are not equaling 4 because there's a missing frame because the hardware ceased to function. More decimals, is it possible? Yeah, we're still kind of relying on the physical, aren't we? Just like the Asian friend sister said, Asiatic, because don't forget, Asiatic included many people, not just the Asian, but Aryan too, and many people who were allied with them. They were not a bad people. The Aryan, not a bad people. Many people, not a bad people. We all eventually mentioned at some point in time as a people that we'd done this or we'd done that and we'd been bad. We'd been mean and violent. And we all wanted to move on, right? We all wanted to have governments and freedom and democracy, stuff like that. We all wanted to feel great. And without a doubt, the issue is that the latency imposed upon computers does allow spying. it does allow manipulation. And that, for instance, could be something that's used in offices or computers that are governed by an administrator. So, why is it that personal computers have this stuff inside? Because maybe it's more expensive to make both. But in my opinion, manipulation and eavesdropping doesn't need to be in a computer. 0 and 1 can still equal that, and it could be on the software level before um, before that data is provided to the user, so that an administrator can change it if they need to. It's still possible, but it would be on a software level rather than a hardware level, and that is pretty cool. That is an honest computer. This is Robert from DSP Plug talking about all of these amazing dreams that we had for computers, what they could do, the kind of peace and comfort that they could provide us, and they do. But what could a faster, more honest computer do for us?